I'm very happy to be here with Daniel Jupp, who is a writer that I respect probably more than just about anybody else. I put him on a par, at least, with Mark Stein, one of my heroes, equally brilliant writer. And today we're going to be discussing the subject of anti-Semitism. We've sort of agreed a number of particular topics therein to discuss, but this is going to be completely unscripted and we'll be asking each other, I guess, some of these questions. The first thing is maybe you want to introduce yourself, Daniel, and then I'll introduce myself.
My name's Daniel Jupp. I'm English nationalist and a sort of big Trump supporter, big MAGA fan, so a populist. And I've been arguing politics starting online maybe 15 years ago. So for a long time, I've had 3 books published, 2 by Bombardier in the US, covering sort of a populist take on political issues of the day. So I never believed when I started out that I would be spending a lot of time speaking about Israel or defending Jews. It wasn't something that was in my ballpark. I'm not Jewish myself, obviously. I don't recall any Jewish people being in my school when I was growing up. I wasn't from a neighborhood that had lots of Jewish people, but I noticed online when I was starting to discuss political issues, and this is going back over a decade now, that no matter what the subject was, there was always someone available, someone who would come in who would somehow turn it to anti-Semitism and turn it to hatred of Jews in some way or another. So whether it was, discussing open borders and immigration, and someone would bring it and say that this was some kind of Jewish plot. So I've never subscribed to anti-Semitism. I've never understood it. I've never considered it rational or reasonable, and I've never been seduced by any of its arguments. So I just started naturally fighting back against it, and I found myself, as anti-Semitism I think has got worse, spending more and more time doing that, as well as defending Western civilization in general, and defending white people from racism towards them, or defending England and its record as an English nationalist. So, I spend a lot of time doing both things now.
Okay, that's great. I mean, for those who don't know me, I guess I should also introduce myself and why I'm interested in this topic. So, unlike you, I am Jewish and consider myself a proud Jew. I actually have a kosher home. I mean, my wife was more Orthodox. She came from quite an Orthodox family. We both have close family in Israel. In fact, for both of us, our maternal grandfathers come from Jerusalem. Like 95% of Jews, and in fact, I'd say 99% of practicing Jews. I'm a Zionist, and that's simply the belief in the right of Jews to their ancestral homeland. I've never hidden my Judaism, but as a public figure, which I became during COVID because I was one of those who were challenging the official narrative and being attacked for that as a conspiracy theorist, but nothing that the anti-Semitism didn't at all come in there. But in fact, the first time I publicly stated that I was a Jew as part of that was actually to come out in defense of Andrew Bridgen, who'd been accused of anti-Semitism in what I felt was an unfair way. The problem is that all hell broke loose after 7th October when I came out clearly as a Zionist, whereupon I discovered many previous colleagues who were in the medical freedom movement turned out to be hardcore anti-Semites.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about just a little bit before we go on to the other questions about that context of because it seems to me as a non-Jew that it's fairly obvious that anti-Semitism has either been exposed a lot more or has increased a lot more in recent years, and we've seen it sort of normalized and become very, very widespread following the October the 7th attacks. It's now, a few days past the second anniversary of that. We'll talk a bit more, Matt, about that later. But would you agree that there's this context of it being more prevalent now, or at least more exposed?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that in a sense was part of the October 7th planning as well. There's evidence of systemic organizational activities to capitalize on the October the 7th attacks, even before the October the 7th attacks themselves.
Yeah, and sort of one of the things in that context that is remarkable to me is the extent to which, because from my perspective, I've never understood it, and one of the reasons I've not understood it is because Jewish populations tend to be small, they tend to integrate very well, so they're kind of automatically by numbers and by behaviour not a big threat to host nations. If England's example is taken, we've got a few 100,000. Is it 700,000
Oh no,
Jews as
no.
well?
The total population, total Jewish population of the UK is 270,000.
Wow, so
More than
it's
most
lower
people.
even than I thought, but it's nothing like the
270,000.
levels that would be just by pure demographic change would be threatening a host community, and it's not like that anywhere in the world, really, is it?
Yeah, it's not. So these are insignificant numbers. Yeah.
It's just got 15 million Jews worldwide, isn't it?
Yeah, 15 or 16 million at most.
Yeah. So, it's not
Almost.
a group of a size to be a threat. And there's no evidence, as far as I've ever seen, of where you can point out this is a particular kind of very, very dangerous activity that Jews disproportionately engage in. There's no Jewish rape gangs. There's no Jewish suicide bombings across the Western world. So the kind of context to me seems very, very odd. There's none of the behaviours that you would see would maybe suggest why people have that hate and why people have that fear.
Yeah, and incidentally, on that point, even in the areas where there's at least a perception that there are a disproportionate number of Jews in that particular profession, like, for example, in media, Hollywood, some people think in politics, law, etc. Even there, the perception of that disproportionate amount is always exaggerated. But even where they do have some influence, which may or may not be disproportional, what people always seem to focus on in that case when it's, for example, something that they don't agree with. So, for example, I'll give a very simple example. And I believe you, of course, don't believe in mass migration and population replacement by
Yeah.
people from cultures very different to our own. And just because there have been Jewish figures in politics or elsewhere promoting those types of activities, people focus on them, even though in those cases they're no more vocal or proportionally vocal than any other leftists which are
Well,
promoting.
I'd say the really obvious one there is George Soros, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because the Open Society foundations, the influence of George Soros in wanting nations in the Western world with open borders has been enormous. But nobody seems to then follow from that. The kind of people who hate Jews and use Soros as an example never follow from that Soros is highly critical of Israel, has no kind of
He
loyalty
funds
to Israel.
most of the major anti-Israel NGOs.
Yes, yeah. And at the same time, he's not a practicing follower of Judaism. He seems to be, as far as I can tell, he seems to be an atheist.
He's
Um,
Yes, he's very openly an atheist. He said both of his parents were anti-Semitic Jews. They hated the religion.
yeah, and he, all right, under duress and as a teenager trying to survive, but he did collaborate with the Nazis in World War II.
He described it as the happiest days of his life.
Yeah, which is really, really disturbing. So you can immediately debunk this idea that George Soros is pushing a Jewish agenda because he's not doing that any more than Karl Marx famously as well was of Jewish descent, but absolutely despised Jews and was his left wing works were rife with anti-Semitic commentary.
Yep.
So when you find these people like that, who are often cited as examples of Jewish malice or Jewish conspiracy, you nearly always find in those cases that they're very strong leftists. It's
Yep.
leftist ideology that they're pushing, and they themselves hate Jews.
Exactly. It's the same with Hollywood. It's exactly the same thing that those prominent Jews who are promoting, let's say, the kind of woke ideology that we despise happen to be people who are Jews in name only at most, and who are actually incidentally also promoting anti-Israel narratives.
Yeah, and one of the things that is ridiculous about it is because the very people who say you should notice the handful of Jews who are involved in these malign activities, who are all leftists, and you
Yeah,
should notice their Jewishness, are the same people in many instances who always say if there are malign actors who are Muslim, we shouldn't notice that they're
exactly.
Muslim. We shouldn't
That's
focus on the
that's
fact
a
that they're
great
Muslim.
point. That's exactly the case. Yeah.
Let's define what anti-Semitism is, because I always think it's important to define your terms as early as possible. And there's controversy around that as well, isn't it? Because you get people who are saying, "Well, I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm just criticising Israel." How would you define it?
I'm quite happy with the IHRA definition, which says that, I'll read it out, it's a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And it says it's rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, institutions, religious facilities. That's a bit,
It gets a little bit vague at the end
it's a little
there.
bit vague. So that it gives the examples. And the examples I'm especially interested in, and I think are most relevant to this discussion, are those which relate to Israel, because Israel is central to Judaism, it's central to the religion. Just look at the Bible and all of the religious Jewish texts, and you see the central role that Israel played in religion, and of course Jerusalem as the eternal city, etc. So that means, for example, and the IHRA definition gives these examples, that denying Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel as a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. That's an example of anti-Semitism. And applying double standards by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation is anti-Semitic. Using symbols
Yeah,
and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libels, to characterize Israel or Israelis is anti-Semitic. And of course, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis is anti-Semitic. Holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. And of course, all of those things, which are definitions of anti-Semitism, have been
are all
prominent in the
commonplace.
last few years, especially since October the 7th.
Yeah, they've all become very commonplace, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And for me, it's just very obvious that there's hatred of Jews. That's anti-Semitism, and it's very, very difficult to divorce hatred of Israel from hatred of Jews, because, as you say, modern Israel was founded in response to the Holocaust and to the fact that Jews have been persecuted everywhere they've been throughout their history. And Israel is their ancestral homeland. You cannot accurately dispute that. It has had a Jewish connection through thousands and thousands of years. You cannot accurately dispute that. And if you look at the historic record, if you look at not just the Bible, but also you can dig up artifacts in Israel today that are thousands of years old that prove this long Jewish connection there.
Yeah, and
So
there's one thing there about what you said, which I kind of like want to correct you on, is the sort of the popular notion that Israel was created as a response to the Holocaust. It wasn't. The modern Zionist movement, of course, formally started in the 19th century with Herzl, but
yeah,
as you correctly stated, there was continuous Jewish presence in the land, which was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire, and before that, the various other colonial empires. After the Jewish state was basically destroyed by the Romans just after Christ. The point is that there was that continuous presence, but the modern Zionist movement started at a time when that land of Palestine, which was under the Ottoman, of course, Turkish Empire at the time, was essentially destitute. There was very few people there. I
yeah,
mean, Jews were a majority in Jerusalem in that 19th century. That's what I say. That's where both my maternal grandfather and my wife's maternal grandfather were born. In fact, what happened is that the presence of Jews and the influx of Jews then from other places as a result of that Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century, that created the economy in that area, which actually attracted lots of Arab immigrants from Syria, Egypt, and the neighboring communities. So the idea that suddenly Jews were kind of like transported into the Arab nation of Palestine in 1948 is one of the biggest lies which is promoted by anti-Semites as a reason to discredit the modern state of Israel. It just
Yeah, so
did that before 1948, even up to 1967. I can tell you this: the only people who referred themselves as Palestinians were the Jews.
you can see from the time of the Palestinian Mandate, you can see documents from Britain which confirm what you've just said there. And certainly there's this long move Zionist movement through the 19th century, and you've got things like the Balfour Declaration, which is Britain essentially accepting the moral argument that this is an ancestral Jewish homeland and they should be able to return to it. So yeah, I mean that's a good correction that you've given me there. But it's also the case, I think, that there is far more understanding than there is today of the necessity of a Jewish state immediately after the Holocaust. Would you say that's fair to say
Yeah,
from
yeah,
non-Jews?
I think that's fair to say. Of course, especially given that under the British, let's say it was a British mandate at the time, so it was under British control during the Second World War, whilst the Holocaust was going on, and because of the infamous White Paper and the desire, which of course continues through this day, not to upset Arabs and Muslims, the British decided that at the time of their most need, they would actually stop any immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine to avoid their destruction.
It's funny that I spend a lot of time pushing back on narratives of things that the British or the English should be ashamed of, but that's one that normally isn't presented, which I'd say is a kind of more justifiable criticism,
Yeah,
given the context of what was happening.
especially as they'd already decided to give, 2/3 of the Mandate Palestine to become the land of Jordan, which incidentally is comprised of 80% of Palestinians. So it's another
Yes,
curious aspect of the conflict which people don't seem to understand or even acknowledge.
I'd say that most British people who amongst those groups, especially on the left wing, who see they use these terms like settler and invader and colonialists and all of that, all of which derives essentially from Soviet propaganda
Yeah,
that aligned with Hamas and aligned with Palestinian representative groups before Hamas. All of that kind of rhetoric goes back to Soviet rhetoric, and it goes back to, this is why terms like imperialism are used, isn't it? It's that kind of long leftist history of identifying a group of people who are considered the victims, a group of people who are considered the oppressors, and then those identifications remain fixed. So the same way that you get, centuries long now criticism of the British, you now get 80 years of criticism of Israelis, and you
yeah,
get
yeah.
on the same kind of Soviet mandated terms and language.
Yeah, in fact, it was in 1965. It was the Soviet Union who created the notion of Palestinianism, created the terrorist militias. KGB trained them. I mean, Yasser Arafat, the first modern leader, so-called Palestinian leader, of course, wasn't born in Palestine. He came from Egypt. And of
Yeah,
course, before that, remember another thing that somehow seems to be completely unknown, even though it's one of the most well-documented facts of the Second World War, is that the Arabs of Palestine, remember, didn't consider themselves Palestinians. They wanted they were instrumental in trying to stop any further immigration of Jews to land, were led by the Mufti, who was, of course, an ally of Nazi Germany.
yeah. One of the people to sign the Book of Condolence, wasn't he, for Hitler's death?
Yes, yeah.
which is and people, I think people are confused by that quite often as well. That the left thinks it's got this kind of moral sanctity that goes on forever, and that Nazism, which if you don't include hating Jews as a key characteristic of Nazism, when you're labeling people Nazi, you're not being very accurate about what a
Exactly.
Nazi was either, are you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, so the kind of people on the left are kind of simultaneously calling people who are post-mass immigration Nazis, whilst they support Hamas, who treat Jews the same way Nazis do, which is a really, really bizarre conflation of things, isn't it?
It is, and of course, it's also the leftists. Remember that the leftists who claim, for example, that anybody, if someone, let's say, comes from Pakistan or Syria or whatever to the UK, they're suddenly they're British immediately and have all the rights to the British people, and that if you even suggested that they are there illegally and maybe should return to their homeland, you're called a racist, and yet those very same people demand that every single Jew in Israel has no right to live there and should be sent
Yeah,
somewhere else.
maybe it's just the soil of England is magic, and it's just that when people arrive here, they're magically transformed. But that doesn't happen in Israel. That doesn't happen to anyone in Israel. It's very, very easy to run through it and spot the contradictions, isn't it?
It is, and it's just full of, it's just full of contradictions. Of course, incidentally, of course, going back to the whole idea of like the Nazis as well, of course, the left conveniently forget the fact that the Nazis were essentially a socialist party. This is,
Yeah, National Socialist Party,
exactly, yeah,
and now you're treated as some kind of crazy, out there conspiracy theorist if you draw attention to the socialist bit rather than the nationalist bit.
exactly, yeah,
And you think, well, actually, they're a blend of those two things, and you think, which bit did they believe in more? Well, it was total state control that they believed in more, but the nationalism of the Nazi Party itself, you could say, was far less sincere than their socialist principles and their principle that the state has to control everything. That was
exactly.
far more
Take
important for
control,
them.
yeah. Which is the main common theme of so-called Nazism and socialism, communism. Yeah, absolutely. They're one and the same.
Yeah, and all of these, and it's the same with, there's a theocratic version of it with Islam, which is
Oh,
that,
absolutely.
um,
Yeah.
with Islam, everything that anybody does has to be controlled by what
Yeah.
Islam says, which is the same ideology, the same methodology, essentially, as saying that everything has to be controlled by one party. Everything has to be controlled by one religion. Is
Exactly.
just
It's the
a kind
religion
of
in the general
earlier
sense.
arc.
Yeah.
It's an earlier archetype of the same totalitarian thinking.
Yeah. And also, incidentally, the commonality between communism or socialism and Islam in that respect is that they are both religions, of course, and in both cases, they insist that the religion comes above your family.
Yeah. In Maoism, you've got the destruction of the four olds, wasn't it? And one of them was family ties and family connections.
Yep.
And this is why, of course, leftists tend to be very anti-Christian as well after a certain point,
Yep.
and very kind of atheistic in their outlook, because that's a kind of watered down version of what the Soviets were doing and what the communists were doing, which is you cannot tolerate a belief system that existed before your own.
Yep.
Um, so, I mean, just as an aside, do you think that relates partly to hatred of Jews because it's one of the oldest surviving belief systems in the world?
Yeah, and not only that, but it's philosophy of Judaism is the antithesis of those state-controlled religions as well. That they don't demand anything of people outside of the of that religion. There are no demands on anybody else.
It's a non-converting faith,
Yeah,
isn't it? Which is, I said some of the ways in which Judaism has never seemed like a threat to me, and that's a principal one. There's a huge difference between a religion that tells its followers that they have to convert the entire world, including at the point of a sword, and a religion that says we are specific and we don't need to convert anyone else, because that allows those other people to retain their identity. And it's a huge, huge difference, which Jew haters never seem to acknowledge, do they?
They don't know. And it's interesting that there are other religions which are also similarly non-proselytizing, like Judaism, and interesting enough, so whether they be the Druze or the Zoroastrians and groups like that, and they are also, interestingly enough, the persecuted minorities wherever they are.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's time that we talked about the October the 7th anniversary, and maybe we should cover why it hasn't generated sympathy, why October the 7th itself didn't generate sympathy. Do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, there's the whole double standards issue that I raised before. First of all, the focus on Israel's response to what was not just the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, but proportionally so far and away the biggest terrorist atrocity, I would say, of all time. I mean, if you look at the proportionally compared with the US, the 9/11 attacks killed, almost 3,000 Americans, but that's in a population of 350 million. Whereas in Israel, on that day alone, forget about all of the deaths that have actually occurred since, which people have ignored. You had 12,000 people massacred on that one day in a
Yeah.
population of 9 million. So proportionally, we're talking about an order of magnitude above 9/11.
If the US population was the same size as the population of Israel, and then you kind of translate the figures,
Yeah.
it's something like 19 9/11s, isn't it?
Yeah. I say it's about, I was going to say about 20 times more, but that's in
Yeah,
the same ballpark figure. And when you think about the reaction to, let's say, the worst terrorist attacks in the UK, be they the IRA attacks or more recently the Islamic attacks like the 7/7 attacks, where, what was there? It was like 50 people killed there in a
yeah.
population of, 60 million. Then we're talking about several hundred times proportionally greater than the severity of those attacks. So on the one hand, you have this incredible life-changing event for every single Israeli, and indeed every single Zionist, every single Jew with any association or attachment to Israel. The impact is never going to leave us. And yet somehow that's brushed aside, almost ignored, to focus on Israel's completely rational response to try and get rid of the very people who not only did it, but have said they absolutely are going to do it over and over again until every Jew is killed. And all of their actions indicate that that's what they would do.
And they have that attitude worldwide, which is what global intifada means as well, isn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
And you've got Mamdani in New York, who might become New York mayor after, which seems an incredible thing after 9/11 there, that an Islamist, a guy who is basically supportive of Islamic terrorist groups, certainly to the extent of, justifying their actions, as many people in Britain do, becoming mayor of New York after they've had 9/11, which is, 20 years later, and it's like people have learned nothing at all. It really is astonishing how quickly people forgot October the 7th itself, and had how little sympathy they had for October the 7th. Because, when I look at that, I said, well, you've got a clear initiator of the conflict. Many of the arguments that say, well, they're responding to Israeli oppression are easily debunked, and you can look at them very quickly and dispute them. Yes, there's been a lot ongoing dispute and ongoing conflict in the Middle East for a long time, but surely no rational person can look at what happened on October the 7th and say to themselves that's justified. But lots of people do seem to have done that in response to October the 7th, and like you say, they've immediately forgotten what happened there. So
But
I don't know,
even
I
whilst the
think it might
massacre
be
was still
important.
taking place, remember, they were holding demonstrations claiming that Israel was committing a genocide. Israel never even started their response to October the 7th until 3 weeks later. And yet, on the same day and then the next week, there were these mass demonstrations against Israel in the UK and elsewhere. I mean, it's just, to me, that and many others, that was not only incredible, but it compounded our anger at what had actually happened.
Going back to you mentioned some terrorist attacks that weren't specifically targeted at Jews.
Yeah,
And I'd say there's a linked problem there, because those are instantly forgotten as well. You know, with every terrorist attack that's initiated by Islam, people say Islam is a religion of peace.
yeah.
People instantly forgive the attack itself. People focus on whether someone's being too mean to Muslims in response to the attack, and not the attacker itself themselves. There's no looking at Islam and saying, well, you know, how much is Islam as a whole responsible for this? You're not allowed to think like that. You're not allowed to argue like that. And if you do, you're called a bigot straight away, and you're called a far right straight away. With the attacks in London and elsewhere in the Western world, we ignore those as well, don't we? As well as October 7th being ignored.
They are ignored. The Islamic angle of it is ignored. That's the key thing. I mean, people still will remember those attacks and remember names of people who were killed. There is still sympathy, almost universal sympathy with the victims, but there was no universal sympathy with the victims of the October the 7th attack, primarily because it was mainly Jews, and no sympathy or understanding of Israel's response in relation to the 250 innocents who were taken hostage there, of whom 50 still remain, although many of those, of course, are just dead bodies now. No sympathy again with that from the general public. And again, that's kind of like most ignored. I mean, none of these people protesting against Israel and claiming they're simply protesting against the war ever simply say return the hostages, which is the one thing which would actually end the current war. And just one other thing about this that's important, I think, as well, is that there's also a failure to recognise, and again, you'd probably be called a racist simply for raising it, the fact that the so-called dispute, I mean, you mentioned it's been going on for many years before October the 7th between Israel and its enemies. The assumption that it's a dispute over land is of course wrong. It was always about religion. The Muslims cannot tolerate a Jewish nation in the Middle East amongst them.
Yeah, I think, say for example, by some accident of history, a Crusader state had been re-established in the Middle East by the UN. There would be the same process going on, wouldn't there? There would be no Arab nation surrounding that would accept its existence, would they?
You don't have to imagine it. Look what happened to Egypt, which was a Coptic Christian country. Look what happened to Lebanon, which had a Christian majority.
Yeah,
Even relatively
yeah,
recent, in the 1950s. I mean, they always said they come,
yeah.
come for the Saturday people first and then the Sunday people.
And that's true of the Left Alliance as well, isn't it? The Left Alliance are kind of happily cheering on attacks where Christian children have been killed and have no concern whatsoever. One of the things that's kind of noticeable is if you compare the Israel-Hamas conflict going on at the moment and the amount of attention it receives compared to other conflicts in the world that are very significant. We've got Sudan, I think about 2008, 1.4 million deaths there.
Yeah. And genuine famine as well.
A genuine famine there. There's virtually no attention. You've got the Maghreb region, and you've got Nigeria, where over 100,000 Christians have been killed. Yeah. There's no concentration on that whatsoever. So there's this extraordinary, I think that's one of the things that proves it's anti-Semitic for me.
Yeah, that's
this level of concentration on Israel and Hamas, and Israel defending itself. It's not only unjust because it's responding to terrorism, not initiating it. It's unjust because there are far larger conflicts with bigger death tolls, higher number of people who have been displaced, millions displaced from Ukraine, there's millions displaced from Sudan, far more than is happening in Gaza.
Yeah,
But 95% of the focus is on what's happening in Gaza.
yeah, absolutely. So it's not just that those double standards and the ignoring those much more bitter and deadly conflicts while concentrating on what the Jews are doing. If you look at the people who are on these anti-Israel demonstrations, you speak to them, even the non-Muslims amongst them, and there's a significant number, these middle-class leftists in particular, you will see a visceral hatred that is irrational. Not just because you think, well, why are they so upset about what's happening there and yet have no interest in similar things happening elsewhere? That's one thing. But it's that visceral hatred that they show that leads them, for example, as we see, yesterday, or ever since October 7th, they'll actually go out of their way to tear down yellow ribbons simply put up in support of the hostages that are still held in Gaza. That enrages them to such an extent that they're prepared to commit criminal acts. Same with Palestine Action and all those guys. They're enraged so much by it that they're prepared to commit these criminal acts to somehow allay their anger. I don't know. It's just, to me, that is as obviously anti-Semitic as you can imagine.
Yeah, I agree, and I definitely think that level of hatred in response and that level of focus in response is what proves that it's not an issue with Israel; it's an issue with Jews, hatred of Jews, at which the kind of conflict gives an excuse to manifest.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, you mentioned before about this sort of the leftist Green Alliance. I mean, why, other than the things that we discussed so far, is there any other reasons why you think that is such a kind of like a dominant feature in the discussions about anti-Semitism?
Cynically, leftists are always looking for client groups because you grab your client group and they are your foot soldiers. They are your people that you can use to deliver what you want to enact. And so just on a sheer numerical level, referring back to what we said earlier, if you can get 200,000 people in Britain who are your foot soldiers, that's a lot less useful to you than getting 4 million or 5 million people who are your foot soldiers. And, you're not going to pick a peaceful, integrated group for that. You're going to want, if you want them to be prepared to do violence, which extreme leftism wants them to be able to do, if you want them prepared to break laws, prepared to riot, prepared to kind of behave in disgraceful ways to help you get into power or stay in power, you're not going to look for the most integrated, the most peaceful, the kind of low number group that doesn't do that kind of stuff anyway. In the UK, if you look at the Labour Party, for example, the Labour Party, I think, is and very, very strongly aligned itself with Muslim representation and Muslim groups against Israel and with Gaza, because to placate these Muslim groups, you have to be against Israel. Unfortunately, it's a cowardly calculation in one sense, in that if you speak against Israel and if you speak against Jews, you are very unlikely to be murdered for doing that.
Yep.
If you speak against Islam and you speak against Palestinians, you're far more likely to be murdered for that.
Yep.
So it's cowardly in that sense, and it's cowardly in the sense of the British authorities, like police and British MPs and the British establishment, because they know which group will be violent. They know which group will riot and will target them if they offend them. And we're not supposed to notice that outside of the establishment, but we do. And we know that that's also why it's very, very easy to keep kicking the white working class, because the white working class, there's not been far-right terrorism in the UK.
Yeah.
There's not been. What have we done in response to how we're regarded and how we're spoken about? we've raised flags on poles.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't blown up Manchester Arena or anything. And it's exactly the same with the Jews. So there's a cowardly calculation for this alignment with the left, and there's also a cynical calculation in that gives you the numbers that you need.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it, that history has proven, if you think about, especially about Iran and even the Arab Spring, that whenever the leftists do align with the Islamists and even use them, as you say, as their foot soldiers, they are always the ones that become the first victims of the
Yes.
Islamists when the revolution actually that they want, that they jointly want, actually happens.
That's very true historically, and everywhere the left has aligned with, you know, like the Iranian Revolution, student revolutionaries, most of whom were actually left-wing rather than jihadist at the start of it, they then align with the jihadists, and the jihadists kill them as soon as they're in power.
Exactly.
And that is repeated multiple times, and the radical leftists don't learn from this. They haven't kind of noticed that this happens to them. But even kind of people who are kind of armchair terrorists, like the current Labour Party, people who would never do any of this stuff themselves, who would never be out on the street fighting, but who will verbally support terrorist groups or excuse them when it's from aligned groups, they seem to think that they're going to be protected and nothing will happen to them. Well, you know, if a radical left Islamic alliance took over the UK, those people would be lined up and shot as well. You know, they'd be as subject to it as anyone else.
Unless they convert to Islam, of course.
Yes, they don't understand that, and part of working within their own delusional framework is that they seem to have convinced themselves that all Muslims will accommodate them and go along with them, and to keep voting for them. Well, they're not even voting for them now. As soon as they get the numbers that they need to have their own parties and have their own representation. We've got the Corbyn group in the UK being formed now. We had a by-election recently where, despite bending over backwards for Islam and despite doing kind of outrageously evil things, like apparently a whistleblower from the prison service who says that Southport protesters who were banged up for offending Islam and for kind of protesting against another atrocity, those people were put on wings in prison with Muslim gangs, with the authorities knowing that they would be attacked. Now, that's just a claim at the moment, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. That's how much the authorities in the UK are aligning with Islamic interests now, no matter how extreme those Islamic interests are. But maybe you can wrest this back to the anti-Semitic issue from what I've just said there.
Other than the things we've discussed about the belief in both Islam and the far left having the belief in their religion, whether it's socialism or Islam, above all else, that comes before anything else, and they're never going to be happy until you've got that worldwide adoption of their religion. The other, of course, common theme amongst them is the anti-Semitism, which we've been discussing today. It's common to both of them. It's a uniting feature. They both believe that the Jews control the world.
In my camp, there's an awful lot of rhetoric that you could put in the mouth of the modern leftist, especially the more radical ones, and it would sound the same. You know, there's lots and lots of talk against capitalism.
Well, people, do you remember there was the case study where someone used significant chunks of Mein Kampf and just changed a couple of things, and it was like welcomed by the socialists in an academic.
Yeah, and I think someone went around campuses in a expose way, and they went around US campuses and they were delivering Hitler comments, and left-wing reactors in the US on the campuses loved it.
Absolutely.
They absolutely loved what Hitler said, because it's this idea, it's this kind of loser's manifesto, isn't it? It's this idea that if people are successful, and Jewish people tend to be successful, tend to integrate, tend to do well in professions, it can't be because they have positive cultural memes. Like, it can't be because Jewish people work hard or because Jewish people have a focus on education, and it certainly can't be because they're intelligent. It has to be a conspiracy,
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
is how the kind of loser responds to that. And it's the same with historically looking at white success. You get the same reaction. The reason that these empires were built by white people was purely exploitative. They didn't invent anything themselves. They weren't more technologically advanced than the people they encountered. It's all down to those people being evil and exploiters. And one of the things that strikes me as a kind of white English nationalist is how similar the narratives are. That success can't be from being better at something. It has to be from being malign.
Yeah.
And that's the whole left wing ethos there, isn't it?
It is, and if can I just? It's interesting. Whilst we're talking about, as we've been talking about the sort of the leftist Islamist alliance and context of anti-Semitism, what about this? I mean, some say it's a relatively new phenomenon. I'm not so sure about the so-called woke right anti-Semitism, which has also become a very, very big issue since October the 7th, and in particular because people who had been previously not in any way considered anti-Semitic and were actually traditionally very sympathetic to Israel, suddenly bought into this alternative conspiratorial narrative that the Zionists control everything and the root of all evil.
Yeah, I mean, initially you would look at it and you'd say, why would anyone on the right align with Jew hatred? Because if you want ethnic minorities that integrate, if you want the ethnic minorities that contribute, then you should be holding up Jews as a standard for others to follow, and especially interacting with conservative and Zionist Jewish people. I know that they're as right wing as me, and I know that they are. They believe in a work ethic, they believe in contribution, they don't want handouts, they don't want special privileges. They're a model of right wing ideology in its best sense. But we've had this kind of this shift, and it comes from alternative media. I hate the phrase woke right because I
Yeah.
think that's partly people in the centre of politics denying that they facilitated all of the kind of terrible things that wokeness is, which came from the left. But there's definitely this segment, it's the Candace Owens, the Tucker Carlson, the Daryl Cooper kind of framework of people in the first two cases, particular, who were once called right wing, who are now quite obviously, to me, Jew haters. I think the explanation for it is either they had a pre-existing prejudice against Jews personally, that it was already in them and they've now got the excuse to manifest it, or there is, another explanation for it, and that could be you go down the rabbit hole. Once mainstream society has betrayed people in the ways that it did, with kind of COVID narratives,
Climate change stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
the attacks against all kind of right wing opinion, people then go down a rabbit hole and they can go too far in conspiratorial thinking. There's some things that you can say, yes, that's it's not conspiratorial thinking to say that our ruling class were maligned during COVID. That was obviously the
Yeah.
case, and you can objectively prove it. But then people look for an explanation behind that. And the oldest conspiracy theory there is, which is always making itself available to be found, is hating Jews. So if
Yeah.
you go too far down a rabbit hole and become skeptical about everything, then you become not skeptical enough about the messages you get from the alternative.
This is the thing about, as I'd mentioned right at the beginning, people who I'd considered to be colleagues and even friends after October 7th, some turned out to be complete outright anti-Semites, but others who really disappointed me bought straight into the Hamas propaganda narrative, which was propagated by the very organizations, incidentally, which they knew were lying over COVID and climate change. So we're talking about the BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, the New York Times, all of those sources, they knew lied about those narratives, which they saw through, and yet they completely believed them about Israel and Gaza, this belief that it was Israel committing genocide and, the Palestinians were the poor victims here. And as you said, that, what is that? Is that because of latent anti-Semitism? I don't know, but I've got personal experiences which affected me. So people who I would never have considered to be anti-Semitic coming up with these incredible blood libels against Israel. I
Yeah.
mean, Neil Oliver, for example, who'd been one of the people I most admired, many people admired, with his great monologues during COVID. And I'd been on it, fun enough, I'd been on his show just, I think, literally a week before October the 7th, and we were talking about these things. And yet, a couple of weeks later, after October the 7th, in one of his monologues, where he's talking about, again, he's making the sort of genocide claim, and he made the statement, he said, it's not manna that falls from heaven onto babies in Gaza, but white phosphorus that burns them to dust. I mean, it was a complete lie because there was no use of white phosphorus
Yes.
in Gaza then. And I challenged him privately on this, and he basically doubled down. He was essentially only listening to people who were anti-Zionist because he'd already bought into this Zionist world control, whatever. And then you got people like Andrew Bridgen, who, as I said, I defended when I felt he was unjustly accused of anti-Semitism when he spoke about COVID, and he claimed to be quoting a Jewish professor who said it was like the biggest disaster since the Holocaust. And
Yeah.
saying that I didn't think was in any way anti-Semitic. And
No.
I was prepared to actually defend him because that was when he got suspended from the Conservative Party. He's since had this libel case against Matt Hancock, who accused him of being anti-Semite, and I was going to defend him on this. But he also, after October 7th, came out with a number of blood libels against Israel, claiming that they were deliberately, for example, killing Christian nuns in Gaza and stuff like that. And even though I privately showed him how that had been convincingly debunked, these stories were actually not true, and asked him to clarify at least, or maybe apologize. And he refused to do so. He refused to do so to the extent that when his lawyer asked me if I was still going to make this character witness statement on his behalf in his case against Matt Hancock, I said I'd be happy to do so if he finally apologizes for these blood libels he'd made against Israel, and refused to do so. So he was happy, rather than apologize, saying which had been provably false. He was happy to lose me as a
Well,
character witness on his behalf in an anti-Semitism case. And just the final point, so on that, because this is what
sure.
really bugs me about this, is that then you get this bizarre situation where people who are definitely not anti-Semites, who've actually been quite vocal supporters of Israel, suddenly decide that they've seen a photo. I mean, the examples, that's photo of a skeletal child who actually turned out to be from a well-fed family, but was suffering from a congenital muscular disease, who Israel had already got from Gaza to Italy for treatment. But that was that front page story from the New York Times, which all of the major British newspapers put up as evidence that Israel was deliberately starving Gazan children. And you get people like, I'll name them because I've named them publicly,
Yeah.
people who were supporters of Israel, Michelle Dewberry, Charlotte Gill, as well as people like Andrew Bridgen, saying, right, I've seen this picture of this starving child. I can no longer accept what Israel is doing. They've got to stop. I mean, how irrational is that?
It's the gullibility of it from people who prided themselves on being skeptics, and people who said, well, we're not like the mainstream. We don't automatically accept what mainstream media delivers to us. And then that's exactly what they did with those photos of the starving person who turned out to have congenital conditions. And that they don't seem to notice who they align with as well. That because how can you be someone like Tucker Carlson on the Woke Rght, as it's called, and you've been saying, don't believe the mainstream media. The mainstream media do nothing but lie. don't side with the mainstream media, and then side with the mainstream media on how you should look at what Israel is doing.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
know what, and at the same time, you're telling yourself that the Jews control the world's media when
I,
when there's nothing but relentless criticism of the only Jewish nation that's
exactly.
false, that's spread by mainstream media, and that you, the great rebel Tucker Carlson, is just automatically accepting.
On that issue of people like Tucker Carlson in particular, because he's such a prominent example. I mean, we know he got that £20 million from a Muslim partner to set up his own website after he left Fox News. But do you think that there's, for example, maybe Qatari funding behind him? Of course, he did a very sympathetic interview with Qatari leaders in Qatar and was certainly paid
Yeah,
more
for which
expensive. I
he was
mean, is there
paid at
something
least
more?
two
I mean,
hundred
who is
thousand
actually
dollars a
funding
year.
a lot of this anti-Semitism associated with on the backs of the conflict in Gaza?
I do believe for the woke influencers who seem to sort of en masse, not the woke, the anti-woke influencers actually, who en masse seem to have turned against Israel and spreading anti-Semitic stuff. You look at someone like Nick Fuentes, and he's everything that the left say that people on the right generally are. He's a genuine racist, and I think with someone like him, it was already there. With many of the people who have done it since, who are kind of very, very hateful towards Israel and hateful towards Jews. Candace Owens, years back, asked me 5 years ago, I would still said she's good. Asked me 10 years ago, I would have said she was great. I think she's either personally mentally unbalanced or she's been paid. Those are the only two explanations that seem rational to me, because the scale of stuff she's putting out and the kind of insanity of it is such that I'd
No, sorry,
say
and you know something? I'm not so sure. I think Tucker Carlson is being paid by Qatar, but I
yeah,
think people like these other influencers, and I include Candace Owens in this, I
yeah,
think she's taken this approach because she can earn money from clicks as a result of it, because there are 2 billion Muslims in the world, and as well as all of the leftists who want to hear the kind of stuff that she's saying, will subscribe to her YouTube or her website, whatever. They don't have to pay for that. They're going to get the money from YouTube or whatever, simply because of the number of subscribers, number of people watching it. And I think that's sufficient funding for her to want to go down that route. And the thing about Qatari funding, as well as funding from China, Russia, as well as other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, I'm not so convinced that it's a case of them directly giving money to these
yeah.
people, other than maybe a very few, but they're buying all of the influence. Though for years, Qatar has effectively been buying up universities and university departments
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
funding all of these anti-Israel activities. And it's that indoctrination that's been taking place in the institutions funded by countries like Qatar, which has created this increased, intensified anti-Semitism.
Well, if you look at Qatar is the biggest foreign funder of universities in the US. They've got a 10-year plan now to invest 500 billion in the US. They've supplied 39.8 billion so far to think tanks, lobbying firms, and news groups. So, some of the mainstream media, they're getting direct funding from Qatar. As a foreign donor to universities in the US, they've given 6.25 billion. And I think it's impossible to believe that this amount of funding is given without strings attached. Now, Qatar was also backing Hamas, hosting Hamas leaders.
And still
This
is.
is why Israel attacked targets in Qatar, because they were targets where Hamas leaders were being sheltered. And the idea that this country is sympathetic to Hamas, to the extent that they're hosting Hamas, that they're helping to fund Hamas, and you let them at the same time be the biggest foreign funder of your universities. We then see in US universities this alliance of the red and the green, the kind of socialist student groups, the communist student groups, and Islam. To pretend that that has nothing to do with Qatari funding is ridiculous to me, I think, because that funding's always going to be linked to what do they get for it. You know, are there specific academic posts and specific academics who are selected because of that funding? And I think we'll probably find out that there are.
We are.
And
There's evidence of that, and there's evidence of it very much in the UK. I'm conscious of the time here now. Is there anything else that you want to say about the causes or the manifestations of anti-Semitism that we haven't discussed so far? I mean, there's one thing I maybe feel it is important to point out. We sort of touched on it, and it is the role of small number of leftist Jews. I am particularly concerned about the role of organizations like the ADL in America, which is a far left organization pretending to speak on behalf of Jews. And in the UK, we've got similar organizations like the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who are basically an arm of the Labour Party, claiming to speak on behalf of Jews, who are promoting policies which are actually leading to anti-Semitism themselves, because they're, for example, cozying up to Islamists, welcoming Islamic immigration, but also creating anti-Semitism by people who don't agree with those policies, having the perception that it's these Jewish groups who are pushing them. And that is a problem. People don't realize that this leftist Board of Deputies, the organization which has been responsible for pushing nonsensical pro-Muslim policies in the UK, claims to fight anti-Semitism, but says they're fighting Islamophobia equally ferociously. It's just as important for them, cozying up to all of the anti-Israel politicians, all of that stuff. They are funded directly, but unknowingly, by Jews who belong to synagogues, because there is a levy applied to every synagogue fee, which is the Board of Deputies levy, because they think they think that pays for security for the synagogues, because that's the impression. Oh, the Board of Deputies is representing Jews and it's protecting Jews, and therefore that levy is going towards their protection. It's Jews, most of whom would be completely against most of these Board of Deputies policies, who are funding it.
The important word there is protection, isn't it? And the difference between protection and a protection racket. Because leftism is a protection racket. It tells people we're going to make everything better. Just transfer the power to us, transfer the power to the party and to the state, and we're going to make everything better. We'll protect you, right? And it's particularly done this with ethnic minorities and groups. So if traditionally in the past, yes, there was a right wing that hated some of these groups, the leftist group would say, we'll protect you from them, we'll be your champions. But then what the leftist group does is that it suborns the interests of that group that they claim to be representing to the interests of leftism. And then they use, in Jews in particular, I think this has happened with, where leftists use Jews as both a human shield and a weapon. It's a human shield if you've got a leftist organisation like the ADL. You can put Jews in front of that and then say any attacks on the leftism of that organisation is anti-Semitism, because you've presented a Jew at the front of it.
Yep.
You know,
absolutely.
and they literally use Jews as a human shield.
I do. That's an excellent point.
And at the same time, they then use the leftist Jews as a weapon against people like me, or people who happen to be white, or against Tommy Robinson, for example. You know, the classic example, Tommy Robinson will be accused of being far right all the time. He'll be accused of being anti-Jewish, and he's the most profoundly Jewish public figure in the UK at the moment. He's the white guy who stands up and says, I am a Zionist. So and then he gets criticised from the kind of genuine neo-Nazi right for that. I've kind of followed Tommy in this, and I was there already myself in a lot of ways, where I see a lot of alignment between a conservative Zionist Jewish guy and myself, because we believe in, I think, basic right-wing principles. We believe in the government leaving people alone as much as possible. We believe in working hard. We believe in contributing. We believe that you're not owed anything automatically other than some loyalty from your government to you.
On that point, I think we can end on a slightly positive point, because the fact that someone like Tommy Robinson is increasingly being respected by people who have always hated him because they believed the caricature of him as described by the mainstream media has to be at least a small positive going forward. A glimmer of hope. And I want to thank you, Daniel, for fantastic discussion.
It's been a pleasure, Norman. And one of the things that's been really nice for me is us getting to know each other, and the number of because I'm happen to be a non-Jew who is offended by and detests the kind of evil of hating Jews. I've met some great people, and you're one of them.
And you give unbelievably great support to Jews as well, because we appreciate that support. We really do. Thanks very much. And of
Cheers,
course,
thank you.
up the Spurs.
Yes, up the Spurs. So we share as well.
Okay, thanks.